Sometimes, the quietest man in the room is carrying a story that can change everyone else's. The sharp echo of polished boots rolled through cell block D long before anyone looked up from breakfast. Conversations faded one by one until only the metallic scrape of trays and the distant hum of old ventilation fans remained. Redstone State Penitentiary had its own rhythm, a rhythm built on routine, reputation, and unspoken rules that every inmate and every correctional officer understood. Respect was rarely given. Fear traveled faster than words, and every new morning reminded everyone exactly where they stood in the invisible hierarchy behind concrete walls. Officer Ryan Mitchell understood that better than anyone. At 38 years old, with a neatly pressed uniform and a reputation that reached every corner of the prison, he believed discipline came from absolute authority. The inmates stepped aside whenever he entered a housing unit, not because regulations demanded it, but because experience had taught them that drawing his attention usually made the day much longer. Ryan walked through the corridor with calm confidence, acknowledging no one as steel doors clicked behind him one after another. Across the room, an elderly black inmate slowly carried a breakfast tray toward an empty table near the windows. His name was Elijah Brooks, 68 years old, gray hair cropped close, thin reading glasses tucked neatly into his shirt pocket. His prison uniform looked slightly too large for his lean frame, and his measured steps suggested nothing more than an aging man trying to make it through another ordinary morning. He never rushed. He never argued. He rarely spoke unless someone spoke to him first. Most inmates barely noticed him anymore. The newer arrivals assumed he was simply another quiet old prisoner counting the years. The veteran inmates knew better, though none of them ever explained why. As Elijah passed the center aisle, Ryan stopped directly in front of him, blocking his path with practiced confidence. Several inmates glanced toward the scene before quickly lowering their eyes again. Moments like these were common. Nobody wanted to become part of them. Ryan looked Elijah up and down before letting out a faint laugh that carried farther than he intended. "You moving in slow motion today?" he asked with a voice that echoed through the cafeteria. Elijah simply looked at him, his expression unchanged, saying nothing. The silence seemed to irritate Ryan more than any answer could have. He shifted his weight, making a dismissive motion that knocked Elijah slightly off balance. The breakfast tray tilted, a cup rolled across the floor, and a spoon spun in a wide circle before settling against a table leg with a sharp metallic ring. A few nervous chuckles spread across the room before disappearing almost immediately. Elijah never raised his voice. He never frowned. He simply bent down, picked up the spoon, brushed it clean with a folded napkin, and placed it carefully back onto the tray as though nothing unusual had happened. That single decision caught the attention of inmates who had already started walking away. One by one, heads slowly turned back toward the old man. Along the far wall, two longtime prisoners exchanged a brief glance that lasted less than a second. Another inmate quietly set down his coffee without taking another sip. Near the security station, an older correctional officer paused in the middle of signing paperwork, lifting his eyes toward Elijah with an expression that looked less like curiosity and more like recognition. None of them spoke. None of them warned Ryan. They simply watched. Because while Officer Ryan Mitchell believed he had just embarrassed the weakest man in cell block D, several people in that room suddenly realized something far more important. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The cafeteria remained unusually quiet long after the spoon stopped spinning across the floor. Nobody rushed back into conversation. Nobody laughed again. Even the familiar clatter of breakfast trays seemed softer, as though the entire room had decided, without saying a word, to wait for something none of them could quite explain. Officer Ryan Mitchell glanced around with the satisfaction of someone convinced he had reinforced his authority once again. From his perspective, the moment was over. An old inmate had been reminded of his place. The routine had continued, and order had been preserved. He turned toward the serving line without noticing that several veteran inmates were no longer watching Elijah. They were watching him instead. Elijah Brooks calmly adjusted the edge of his tray, picked up the cup that had rolled only a few feet away, and returned it to its place with slow, deliberate movements. There was no frustration on his face, no embarrassment, no anger. His breathing remained steady, his shoulders relaxed, and his eyes carried the same quiet focus they had held since the moment he entered the cafeteria. He selected a seat near the window, folded his napkin carefully across his lap, and began eating breakfast as though the interruption had never happened. Across the room, Marcus Hill, a young inmate serving his second year, leaned toward the older man seated beside him. "Why is everyone acting so strange?" he whispered. The older inmate, Walter Gaines, kept his eyes on Elijah before answering in a voice barely louder than the hum of the lights overhead. "Because some mistakes do not look like mistakes until later." Marcus frowned. "He is just an old guy." Walter slowly shook his head. "That is exactly what people keep believing." Before Marcus could ask another question, the heavy cafeteria doors opened again. Captain Daniel Harper stepped inside, carrying a stack of housing reports beneath one arm. Harper had spent more than 25 years working inside state prisons. He had seen gangs rise and disappear, officers come and go, and countless inmates try to reinvent themselves behind bars. Very little surprised him anymore. As he crossed the room, his attention drifted toward the window where Elijah quietly ate breakfast alone. Harper slowed almost imperceptibly. For a brief second, recognition crossed his face before disappearing behind the disciplined expression expected from a senior officer. He continued walking without speaking, but his eyes lingered just long enough for another correctional officer to notice. "Everything all right, Captain?" asked Sergeant Michael Torres. Harper answered without taking his eyes. "Completely off the dining area." "Who assigned Brooks to cell block D?" Torres glanced down at the morning roster. "Transfer order came through late yesterday evening. Administrative processing." "What?" Harper accepted the clipboard but did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched Elijah place his empty cup beside his tray with the same careful precision he used for every movement. "Interesting," Harper finally murmured. "Very interesting." Meanwhile, Ryan finished speaking with another officer near the entrance. He caught Harper looking across the cafeteria and assumed the captain had noticed the earlier incident. Confident that his actions would be viewed as routine discipline, Ryan walked over with an easy smile. "Everything is under control, Captain," he said. "Just another inmate testing limits." Harper looked directly at him, his expression impossible to read. "Was he?" Ryan nodded without hesitation. "Quiet type. Refused to answer. Needed a reminder about following instructions." Harper remained silent for several seconds, long enough to make Ryan slightly uncomfortable. Finally, he asked one simple question. "Did you read his full intake file?" Ryan shrugged. "Nothing worth remembering. Elderly inmate. No disciplinary issues during processing." Harper closed the folder in his hands. Sometimes what is missing from a file matters more than what is written inside it. Ryan gave a polite laugh, assuming the comment referred to paperwork delays. Harper did not laugh with him. Instead, he turned and walked toward the administrative hallway, already thinking about a name he had not heard spoken in nearly 15 years. Behind him, the breakfast period continued, but the atmosphere had changed in ways that only a handful of people could recognize. The younger inmates still saw Elijah Brooks as an aging prisoner who preferred silence. The experienced ones saw something entirely different. They recognized patience without fear, composure without surrender, and the kind of quiet confidence that could not be learned inside prison walls. None of them knew exactly what the next few hours would bring, but one thought spread through cell block D with remarkable speed. Whatever story Elijah Brooks had carried into Redstone State Penitentiary, it had not stayed buried for long. Captain Daniel Harper closed the office door behind him and placed the morning housing reports across his desk. The sounds of the prison faded into the background as he opened the digital inmate registry on his computer. He typed 2 words with deliberate care. Elijah Brooks. For a brief moment, the screen remained unchanged before several archived records appeared. Harper leaned closer, his expression growing more serious with each page he reviewed. The standard intake summary listed only the current conviction, transfer history, medical clearance, and expected housing assignment. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained why an elderly inmate carried himself with such remarkable composure. But Harper knew prison records rarely told an entire story. He requested access to older federal background files that had not been opened in years. The system hesitated before displaying a restricted notice followed by a line that immediately caught his attention. Authorized government service verified. Additional information available by clearance request only. Harper slowly leaned back in his chair. He had seen similar notices only a handful of times during his career, and never attached to someone who behaved as quietly as Elijah Brooks. Across the prison yard, the morning recreation period had begun beneath a bright blue sky. Groups of inmates gathered around the walking track, weight benches, and basketball court, each remaining inside familiar circles that reflected alliances formed over many years. Elijah walked alone at an unhurried pace along the outer fence, his hands folded behind his back, as though he were taking a peaceful stroll through a neighborhood park instead of one of the most secure correctional facilities in the state. Younger inmates glanced toward him from time to time before losing interest. To them, he was simply another older prisoner who preferred solitude. The veterans continued watching from a distance with quiet respect that could not easily be explained. Marcus Hill finally approached Walter Gaines once more. "You keep looking at him. Like you know something," Marcus said softly. Walter smiled without taking his eyes off Elijah. Knowing a person and recognizing a person are two different things. Marcus looked confused. "Then which one is he?" Walter waited several seconds before answering. "The kind of man who never needs to announce himself." Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Mitchell observed the recreation yard from an elevated security platform. The conversation with Captain Harper earlier that morning lingered in his thoughts more than he cared to admit. Harper had never directly criticized his judgment, yet the warning hidden inside those few sentences refused to disappear. Ryan told himself he was overthinking the situation. After all, prison life was full of personalities that officers had to manage every single day. An elderly inmate who preferred silence hardly seemed worthy of concern. Still, he found himself looking toward Elijah more often than necessary. Every time he did, he saw exactly the same thing. Calm steps, relaxed shoulders, steady breathing. No attempt to impress anyone. No effort to gain sympathy. No sign of resentment. It was almost unsettling. Later that afternoon, Sergeant Michael Torres entered Harper's office carrying a sealed personnel envelope that had arrived through internal mail. "This came from Central Records," he said. Harper opened the envelope and removed a faded photograph taken many years earlier. 6 men stood side by side wearing plain training uniforms inside what appeared to be a government facility. Their faces looked younger, but one man immediately stood out. Elijah Brooks stood quietly near the center, while several men around him smiled confidently toward the camera. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a short note in black ink. "Lead instructor. Class completed with highest federal evaluation." Harper remained silent for several moments before placing the photograph back inside the envelope. Torres noticed the unusual reaction. "You know him?" Harper answered carefully. "Not personally, but I remember hearing stories long before he ever entered this prison." "Stories about what?" Harper looked through the office window toward the recreation yard where Elijah continued walking alone beneath the afternoon sun. "About a man whose greatest strength was never making other people feel threatened until they realized they had completely misunderstood who he was." At that exact moment, Ryan Mitchell stepped outside to begin the afternoon inspection rounds, still convinced he was dealing with nothing more than an ordinary inmate. He had no idea that pieces of a forgotten history were quietly falling back into place, and that every new discovery was leading the prison one step closer to a truth almost nobody inside Redstone State Penitentiary was prepared to face. The afternoon inspection began with the same precision that governed every hour inside Redstone State Penitentiary. Steel doors unlocked in sequence, officers checked housing assignments, and inmates returned from the recreation yard without unnecessary conversation. From a distance, everything appeared ordinary, but beneath the routine, a subtle shift had begun to spread through cell block D. It was not fear. It was expectation. The older inmates sensed it first, though none of them could have explained exactly why. They simply recognized that the balance inside the block had changed the moment Elijah Brooks walked through those cafeteria doors that morning. Elijah returned to his assigned cell carrying a small stack of library books tucked neatly beneath one arm. His cellmate, Marcus Hill, remained unusually quiet while watching him organize each item with remarkable care. The books were aligned perfectly on the narrow shelf. His folded blanket rested squarely at the foot of the bunk. Even the stainless steel cup beside the sink was placed in exactly the same position every time. Nothing about Elijah suggested someone trying to impress others. Instead, every movement reflected years of quiet discipline that seemed almost effortless. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Elijah looked up with a calm smile. You already have. Marcus could not help smiling back. Why does everybody keep looking at you like they know something I do not? Elijah considered the question before answering. People often see what they expect to see. Sometimes they notice more when expectations begin to disappear. Marcus frowned thoughtfully. That sounds like something a professor would say. Elijah chuckled softly. Life teaches lessons in many classrooms. Before Marcus could continue, the afternoon count was announced over the loudspeaker. Cell doors remained open while officers completed another routine inspection. Officer Ryan Mitchell entered the housing unit carrying a clipboard, stopping briefly outside each cell. His expression remained confident, but his attention repeatedly drifted toward Elijah. Every report he reviewed described the elderly inmate as cooperative, respectful, and remarkably consistent. There were no disciplinary reports, no complaints, no conflicts. The complete absence of trouble somehow bothered Ryan more than repeated violations ever could. As he reached Elijah's cell, he paused longer than necessary. Everything in order here? Ryan asked. Elijah looked up from the open book resting on his lap. Yes, officer. The answer came without hesitation, without sarcasm, and without even the slightest trace of resentment. Ryan glanced around the spotless cell before nodding once and moving on. Marcus waited until the footsteps faded into the corridor. You are not even angry about this morning, are you? Elijah slowly closed his book. Anger is a heavy thing to carry. I have learned to travel lighter than that. Across the hall, several veteran inmates exchanged quiet glances after overhearing the conversation. Walter Gaines leaned against the railing and whispered toward another longtime prisoner named Leonard Hayes. Still sounds exactly the same. Leonard nodded almost imperceptibly. Some people become harder after difficult years. Others become steadier. Their conversation ended the moment Captain Daniel Harper entered the housing unit. He walked directly toward Ryan Mitchell without raising his voice. Walk with me, Harper said. The two officers continued toward the administrative corridor where no inmates could overhear them. Ryan expected another discussion about routine procedures, but Harper surprised him with an unexpected question. Have you ever wondered why some people never react when they are challenged? Ryan shrugged. Some are afraid. Harper slowly shook his head. Fear and self-control can look almost identical until the moment they are tested. Ryan remained silent. Harper continued walking before adding another sentence that lingered far longer than either man expected. The strongest people I have ever met were usually the least interested in proving anything. Back inside the housing unit, Elijah reopened his book while the afternoon sunlight stretched across the concrete floor through the narrow security windows. Around him, the familiar sounds of prison life continued exactly as they always had, yet the atmosphere felt undeniably different. Questions were replacing assumptions. Curiosity was replacing confidence. Without making speeches, raising his voice, or seeking attention, Elijah Brooks had become the quiet center of conversations taking place throughout Cell Block D. And although very few people understood why, the prison itself seemed to be waiting for the moment when the rest of his story would finally come into the light. Morning turned into afternoon, and afternoon slowly drifted toward evening as Redstone State Penitentiary settled into another predictable cycle of counts, inspections, and controlled movement. On the surface, nothing appeared different. Yet behind office doors and inside quiet conversations, Elijah Brooks had become the subject of growing curiosity. Captain Daniel Harper returned to the administrative records room, carrying the faded photograph and the restricted personnel file. He placed both items on the desk of records supervisor Linda Carson. She adjusted her reading glasses before examining the documents one more time. I have not seen one of these clearance notices in years, she said quietly. Half of the supporting files are still sealed. Harper nodded. Can you tell who requested the transfer? Linda searched through the electronic archive before stopping at a single authorization page. Federal transfer approval. Priority classification. No explanation attached. Harper studied the screen. That is unusual. Very unusual, Linda replied. Transfers like this normally come with extensive documentation. Harper folded his arms thoughtfully. Instead, someone wanted him moved without drawing attention. Across the prison, Elijah remained in the library, seated near a narrow window overlooking the recreation yard. The afternoon sun reflected softly across the pages of the history book resting in his hands. He read slowly, occasionally turning a page with the same patient rhythm that seemed to define every part of his life. Around him, other inmates whispered while pretending not to watch him. A few recognized his name from years earlier, though none of them possessed the complete story. They only remembered fragments. Stories about discipline. Stories about respect. Stories about a man who rarely raised his voice, but somehow earned the admiration of people whose careers depended on remaining calm under pressure. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Mitchell stood beside the security desk reviewing the evening assignments. Sergeant Michael Torres noticed Ryan staring toward the library entrance once again. "You have looked over there at least 6 times, Torres observed. Ryan forced a small smile. "Just making sure everything stays quiet." Torres raised an eyebrow. "It already is." Ryan hesitated before speaking again. "Does it not seem strange to you?" "What does?" "An inmate transfers into one of the toughest housing units in the prison, and within a day half the veteran inmates start treating him differently." Torres considered the question. "Maybe they know something we do not." Ryan shook his head. "Or maybe they are creating another prison legend." Torres did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced through the observation window where Elijah calmly closed his book before helping another elderly inmate retrieve a volume from a high shelf. The gesture was simple, polite, and completely ordinary. "Legends usually make noise," Torres finally said. "That man has not done anything except read books and treat people with respect." Ryan looked away without responding. Later that evening, Captain Harper received a telephone call from an old colleague who had recently retired from a federal training academy. Harper mentioned only one name: Elijah Brooks. The line became silent for several seconds before the retired instructor spoke in a careful voice. "I wondered if our paths would eventually cross with his again." Harper leaned forward. "You knew him?" "Not well," the man replied. "But I watched him teach. Some instructors focused on technique. Elijah focused on character. He believed self-control mattered more than strength because strength without discipline eventually becomes a problem." Harper listened without interruption. "Why would someone with that reputation end up here?" Another pause followed. "I cannot answer that. What I can tell you is this. If Elijah Brooks is still the man I remember, you should pay close attention to the people around him, not to him. He has always changed the room without trying." When the call ended, Harper remained seated for several minutes, reflecting on those final words. Outside his office window, evening count had begun. Cell doors closed one after another with the familiar echo of heavy steel. Elijah quietly returned to his bunk, opened another book beneath the dim reading light, and continued his evening exactly as he had every hour before. He never sought attention. He never defended his reputation. He never corrected the assumptions people made about him. Yet throughout Redstone State Penitentiary, assumptions were beginning to collapse on their own. And although almost everyone still believed the story had barely started, one truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The quietest man inside Cell Block D was also the one nobody truly understood. The following morning arrived with a steady rain tapping against the narrow windows of Redstone State Penitentiary, turning the gray concrete yard into a mirror that reflected low clouds hanging over the prison walls. Inside Cell Block D, routines unfolded with mechanical precision. Yet the conversations carried a different tone than they had only 24 hours earlier. Fewer jokes echoed through the corridors. More eyes quietly followed Elijah Brooks whenever he walked from one destination to another. He noticed the attention, but it did not change his pace or his expression. He greeted each officer with the same calm courtesy and thanked the kitchen staff before carrying his breakfast tray toward the same table near the window. Officer Ryan Mitchell watched from the entrance. He had spent most of the previous evening replaying Captain Harper's questions in his mind. The comments about missing records, sealed files, and hidden histories refused to leave him alone. Even so, pride remained stronger than curiosity. Ryan convinced himself that too many people inside the prison were building myths around an elderly inmate who had done nothing remarkable. Determined to prove there was nothing unusual about Elijah, he stepped into the cafeteria and deliberately positioned himself along the path leading toward the window tables. Several veteran inmates noticed immediately. Walter Gaines slowly lowered his coffee cup without taking another sip. Leonard Hayes folded his newspaper and quietly leaned back against the wall. Marcus Hill looked from one face to another, sensing tension that seemed invisible to everyone else. Elijah approached carrying his tray with the same measured steps as always. Ryan waited until he stood only a few feet away before speaking. "You seem to enjoy that table by the window," he said. Elijah nodded politely. "It is peaceful there." Ryan gave a faint smile that carried little warmth. "Today you can sit somewhere else." Without the slightest sign of frustration, Elijah answered, "That is perfectly fine." He calmly turned toward another empty table across the room. Ryan blinked in surprise. He had expected resistance, an argument, or at least disappointment. Instead, he received complete cooperation. The unexpected response left him strangely unsettled. As Elijah began walking away, another inmate accidentally brushed against the edge of his tray while passing through the aisle. The cup tilted again, but before it could fall, Elijah shifted the tray with one smooth, almost effortless movement that looked so natural most people barely noticed it. The drink remained perfectly balanced. Not a single drop spilled. Marcus stared in disbelief. Walter quietly smiled into his coffee. Ryan narrowed his eyes. The adjustment had been so quick and controlled that it seemed impossible for someone of Elijah's age. Before anyone could comment, Elijah simply continued walking and sat down at the nearest available table as though nothing unusual had happened. Captain Harper entered the cafeteria only seconds later. His attention moved from Elijah to Ryan, and then to several veteran inmates whose expressions confirmed that they had all witnessed the same small moment. Harper understood immediately that something important had just happened, even though no rules had been broken and no confrontation had taken place. After breakfast, Harper quietly asked Walter Gaines to remain behind for a brief conversation. Walter had spent more than 18 years inside Redstone and rarely volunteered information, but this time he answered without hesitation. "Captain," Walter said softly, "some people spend their lives trying to convince others they are strong. Mr. Brooks has spent his life making sure nobody needs to know." Harper remained silent. Walter continued, "You can ignore that kind of person for a while. Eventually, though, everyone notices the difference." As Walter returned to his housing unit, Ryan stood alone near the security station, replaying the simple movement he had just witnessed. It had lasted less than a second, yet something about it refused to fit the picture he had created of Elijah Brooks. For the first time since the elderly inmate arrived at Redstone, certainty began giving way to doubt, and although Ryan still believed he remained in complete control of the situation, the quiet confidence that had always guided him was beginning to disappear, one unanswered question at a time. The afternoon inspection moved through Cell Block D with quiet efficiency as officers checked doors, verified assignments, and observed the usual routines that rarely changed from one day to the next. Rain continued falling beyond the narrow windows, leaving faint streaks across the reinforced glass, while the housing unit settled into an almost unnatural calm. Captain Daniel Harper remained in the observation area longer than usual, watching without appearing to watch. He had learned years ago that the most revealing moments inside a prison were often the smallest ones. Elijah Brooks stood outside his cell waiting patiently while the inspection continued. His hands rested comfortably at his sides, his shoulders relaxed, and his attention remained on the corridor ahead rather than on the officers surrounding him. Every movement reflected the same quiet discipline that had become impossible to ignore. Officer Ryan Mitchell approached with measured steps, determined to settle the questions that had been growing inside his own mind. He stopped a few feet in front of Elijah and folded his arms. "You always stay this calm?" he asked. Elijah looked at him with steady eyes. "Most days." Ryan gave a skeptical smile. "Most people would have something to say by now." Elijah answered without hesitation. "Not every thought needs to become a conversation." A few nearby inmates exchanged quick glances before returning their attention to the inspection. Ryan took another step forward, still searching for a reaction that refused to appear. "You think staying quiet makes you different?" Elijah gently shook his head. "No, it simply helps me listen." The answer irritated Ryan far more than open disagreement would have. He gestured toward the narrow space beside the wall. "Move over there." Elijah immediately complied without argument. As he stepped toward the indicated position, a maintenance cart rolled unexpectedly from a nearby service doorway after one of its wheels crossed an uneven section of the floor. The cart gathered just enough momentum to drift toward the corridor where an older correctional officer had been carrying a stack of heavy binders. Several people noticed the movement at the same time, but everything unfolded so quickly that nobody had time to react. Elijah took one smooth step sideways, reached out with one hand, and gently caught the handle of the rolling cart before it reached the officer. The motion was simple, controlled, and almost effortless. The binders remained secure. The cart stopped without noise. Nothing fell. Nothing broke. The older officer blinked in surprise before offering a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. Elijah returned the cart to its proper position and smiled. "You are welcome." The entire exchange lasted only a few seconds, yet the corridor became remarkably still. Ryan had watched every movement from only a few feet away. There had been no rushing, no panic, and no wasted effort. Elijah had moved with the kind of balance and timing that could not be explained by chance alone. Captain Harper noticed Ryan's expression change almost immediately. Confidence had been replaced by genuine uncertainty. Nearby, Walter Gaines lowered his head with the faintest hint of a knowing smile. Marcus Hill stared openly, finally understanding why the veteran inmates had reacted so differently from the very beginning. Harper walked toward the older correctional officer whose binders had been spared from hitting the floor. "Everything all right?" he asked. The officer nodded. "Perfectly fine, Captain." Mr. Brooks saw the cart before the rest of us even realized it was moving. Harper glanced toward Elijah, who had already returned to his place near the wall as though nothing noteworthy had happened. Ryan remained silent, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. He had expected hesitation from a man nearly 70 years old. Instead, he had witnessed calm awareness, flawless timing, and complete self-control without the slightest trace of showmanship. For the first time since Elijah arrived at Redstone State Penitentiary, Ryan realized the stories circulating through Cell Block D were not growing because people wanted a legend. They were growing because every ordinary moment seemed to reveal another quiet piece of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering himself while asking for nothing in return. That evening, an unusual stillness settled over Redstone State Penitentiary. The familiar sounds of closing gates, distant announcements, and rolling meal carts continued as they always had, but beneath the routine another conversation was quietly unfolding. It moved through officer stations, maintenance rooms, and housing units without anyone raising their voice. The subject was no longer whether Elijah Brooks was different. The only question that remained was who he had been before arriving behind these walls. Captain Daniel Harper sat alone inside his office with the restricted file open beneath the warm glow of a desk lamp. The photograph rested beside it, showing 6 younger instructors standing together inside a federal training facility many years earlier. Harper picked up the image once again, this time noticing something he had overlooked before. Every other instructor faced the camera with confident smiles. Elijah alone stood slightly behind the others, almost avoiding the center of attention despite the handwritten note identifying him as the lead instructor. Harper quietly smiled to himself. Even decades earlier, the man had apparently preferred humility over recognition. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Sergeant Michael Torres stepped inside, carrying another envelope that had arrived through secure delivery. "This came from Federal Archives," he said. The clearance request was approved. Harper carefully opened the packet and removed a single summary page. Most of the document remained heavily redacted, but one paragraph had been released for institutional reference. He read it silently before looking up at Torres. "Listen to this," Harper said. Elijah Brooks served for more than 30 years as a senior defensive tactics instructor responsible for preparing federal law enforcement personnel, emergency response teams, and specialized correctional training units. Performance evaluations consistently described him as one of the most respected instructors in the program because of his exceptional discipline, judgment, and ability to resolve conflict without unnecessary force. Torres remained speechless for several moments. "That is the same Elijah Brooks." Harper slowly nodded. "The very same. Then half the officers working in this state could have learned from him." Harper closed the folder gently. "It is entirely possible that some already did without ever knowing they would meet him again under these circumstances." At almost the same moment, Officer Ryan Mitchell was completing paperwork in the security office when Harper entered carrying the summary page. Without saying a word, Harper placed the document on the desk in front of him. Ryan began reading. His confident expression gradually disappeared line by line. By the time he reached the final sentence, He quietly lowered the paper onto the desk. "This cannot be right," he murmured. Harper answered calmly. "It has already been verified." Ryan looked toward the corridor outside the office where Elijah had passed only minutes earlier on his way back to the housing unit. "You are telling me that this man spent decades teaching officers?" "Some of the best," Harper replied, "including correctional professionals." Ryan remained silent. Every interaction from the past 2 days returned to his memory with startling clarity. The calm responses, the patient silence, the effortless awareness, the refusal to argue. None of it had been weakness. It had been discipline practiced over an entire lifetime. Meanwhile, Elijah entered cell block D carrying another library book beneath his arm. Marcus Hill looked up from his bunk. "Everyone has been talking about you all day," he admitted. Elijah smiled warmly. "People usually become bored with conversations eventually." Marcus laughed. "I do not think this one is ending anytime soon." Elijah carefully placed the book onto the shelf before answering. "Then perhaps they will eventually discover that titles, careers, and old stories matter much less than how we choose to treat one another today." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, sensing that the answer carried far more meaning than its simple words suggested. Throughout the housing unit, whispers continued to spread as more officers quietly learned the truth hidden inside the sealed records. Respect replaced speculation. Curiosity replaced judgment. Even those who had never spoken to Elijah found themselves looking at him differently, not because he demanded admiration, but because every newly uncovered fact confirmed what the veteran inmates had understood from the beginning. The quiet man reading books beside the window had never needed to prove who he was. Time had done that for him. The next morning, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting long golden beams across the concrete yard of Redstone State Penitentiary. For the first time since Elijah Brooks had arrived, the atmosphere inside cell block D felt noticeably different. The tension had faded, replaced by a quiet respect that no policy manual could have created. Officers carried out their assignments as usual, inmates followed the morning schedule, and the familiar rhythm of prison life continued. Yet everyone sensed that something important had changed. Shortly before breakfast, Captain Daniel Harper received a visitor from the Federal Correctional Training Academy. The man introduced himself as Director Nathan Collins, a silver-haired administrator who had spent decades overseeing instructor development across several federal agencies. Harper escorted him through the administrative corridor, surprised that someone of Collins's position had personally made the 300-mile trip to Redstone. "I appreciate you meeting with me on such short notice," Collins said. "There was one person I wanted to see before I retire next month." Harper already knew the answer before asking. "Elijah Brooks." Collins smiled warmly. "The finest instructor I ever had the privilege of working beside." Word of the visitor quietly spread through the administration building before eventually reaching cell block D. Officers who had doubted the stories now watched with open curiosity as Director Collins entered the housing unit accompanied by Captain Harper. The elderly administrator stopped a few feet from Elijah's cell and removed his visitor badge before extending his hand through the open doorway. "It has been far too many years, my friend," Collins said. Elijah looked genuinely surprised before returning the handshake with quiet warmth. "Nathan, I did not expect to see you here." Collins laughed softly. "Neither did I, but when I heard your name appear in a transfer report, I knew I could not retire without thanking you one more time." Several nearby officers exchanged astonished glances. Ryan Mitchell stood silently near the security station, listening as Collins continued. "Everything I teach new instructors today still begins with lessons I learned from you. You always reminded us that real authority comes from character, never from intimidation. Thousands of officers have benefited from your example, even if most of them never knew your name." Elijah lowered his eyes modestly. "If they became better officers, that is all the recognition I ever needed." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but its impact spread through the housing unit far more quickly than any rumor ever could. Director Collins thanked Elijah once again before leaving the prison, while Captain Harper quietly escorted him back toward the administration building. Neither man noticed that Ryan remained standing exactly where he had been, staring thoughtfully toward Elijah's cell. Later that afternoon, Ryan approached alone. There was no audience waiting for a confrontation, no gathering of inmates expecting another test. He stopped outside the cell, and spoke with a sincerity that surprised even himself. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew anything about you." Elijah closed the book resting on his lap and looked up with the same calm expression he had carried since the day he arrived. "We all make judgments," he replied gently. "What matters is whether we are willing to learn after making them." Ryan nodded slowly. "I am trying to." Elijah smiled. "Then you are already moving in the right direction." Ryan extended his hand. After a brief moment, Elijah accepted it with quiet dignity. No speeches followed. No dramatic celebration filled the corridor. The surrounding inmates simply watched in respectful silence as two men chose understanding over pride. Captain Harper observed the exchange from the end of the hallway before quietly turning away with a faint smile. Sometimes the strongest lesson inside a prison was not taught in a classroom, written in a handbook, or enforced through regulations. Sometimes it came from the calm example of one person whose character remained unchanged regardless of how others treated him. Long after Elijah Brooks returned to his book and the ordinary sounds of Redstone State Penitentiary filled the corridor once again, the people who had witnessed those few quiet moments carried a lesson they would never forget. Respect earned through humility lasts far longer than fear. Created through authority, and the strongest person in the room is often the one who never feels the need to prove it.